Alright, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or should I say monster? God. Now, God is many things. Depending on who you ask, he's non-existent. Or he's a father. Or he's a magical deity who's all-powerful and all-knowing. If you ask me, he's a monster. Assuming, of course, that he exists. So for the duration of this monologue, I'm going to assume that God exists. So I'm going to be ignoring all the various arguments that point out how he doesn't exist. And instead, simply move on to the, okay, he exists, now what? So, there's a number of reasons why he is a monster. And I'm probably going to cover them in multiple monologues. So this is not going to be a fully extensive list, but it's going to be some of my observations. And I apologize to anyone who is Christian, who is used to having all the various Bible verses all laid out for them. Because while I was Christian for 20 years, I always sucked at memorizing Bible verses. I always sucked at memorizing which part of the Bible, which individual things came from. And even in church, when we had to go and look to a certain part of the Bible to read along, which I always kind of felt was kind of pointless if I'm having someone else read it to me. But the only way I was able to get anywhere with this at all was to use eSword on my laptop in church, because otherwise, by the time I got to the part of the Bible where they were talking about where it was at, they were long moved on. So, I'm not quoting Scripture word for word here. Instead, I'm looking at the overall ideas. So, where better to start our journey than the very beginning? Well, we're going to go a little bit past the very beginning, because you can't really get into good and bad, evil and not evil, before you have any kind of sentient life form. Because it's really difficult. I guess if we really wanted to sit here and think about it, we probably could come up with a way to explain how doing certain things to rocks could be somehow evil. But I'm not inclined to do this. So let's move on to Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve, they live in this garden. In this garden, there's all kinds of food that they can eat. They got various animal friends. They got each other. And they got a poisonous tree in the center. Well, this poisonous tree has a certain side effect. Apparently, you gain the knowledge of good and evil. And the way this has been billed to me is them having eaten from that tree is what made humanity sentient as we know it. In other words, it's the reason why humans build cars, it's the reason humans talk, it's the reason humans make art, it's the reason for all that makes humans humans. And there's a few little problems with this idea here. First off, how the hell do you keep every little ant, bee, horse, deer? We're going to go even with some of the traditional meat eaters, so like foxes and wolves. How do you keep any of them from eating any bit of this tree whatsoever? Or if it's just the fruit that does it, how do you keep them from eating just the fruit? And furthermore, so the possible argument could be, well, God. So God built into him an aversion to eating it. Okay. Couldn't he have put that into Adam and Eve and saved us all of this grief? Well, then he wouldn't be able to, test them. And there we stumbled right into the first example of God the monster. So, God the monster decides that he wants to test Adam and Eve by seeing if they will follow his commands to not eat something arbitrarily. So it's literally at this point, because God first of all didn't have to put the tree in there in the first place, or he simply could have just put, like, made it be like a regular apple tree, for instance, or it could have been like a regular orange tree, or any number of trees, right? Okay, and it would have had literally no effect. But no. God wanted to see if they would follow his commands for no other reason than he gave it to them. And anyone who had the misfortune of dealing with me as a kid knows that doesn't fly with me. Because I told you so is never an answer. Much to the annoyance of my mom and any teachers that were unfortunate enough to ever encounter me. So, we put this tree out there to test them. But why? We might say, well, God wanted to see if they would follow his command. But God knew if they would follow his command because God already knows everything. So that is Exhibit A for why he's a monster. Because he either is not God because he doesn't know everything and is not all-powerful, or he knew that they were going to eat the fruit. He knew what it was going to cause. All this cascading pain and suffering. It's almost immeasurable pain and suffering to the world after they ate that fruit. And God knew that this was going to happen. Period. It was going to happen. If you know that something's going to happen, like not just know, like you have intuition, but you literally looked into the future and saw this is what's going to happen. If you put that tree there, then he's not testing anything. See, testing's when you don't know what the outcome's going to be. But God, by his nature, cannot test anything. Because in order for God to test something, he has to already not know what the end result of that test is going to be. So, if you know what the end result's going to be, and you decide to run the test anyway, then you're a monster. Because you know that you're going to cause pain and suffering because of this test that you're running, because you know what the outcome is going to be, and it's going to be pain and suffering. Let me put it another way. This is like someone taking a mouse and hitting them with a 4-pound sled. And after hitting, and then being surprised that when they hit the mouse with a 4-pound sledgehammer, the mouse dies. You know that the mouse is going to die. And in this case, God knew more than you knew that the mouse would die. God knew what would happen more than you knew what would happen to the mouse. So, if God's doing it to test them, he's a monster. If God's doing it to test them because he actually legitimately didn't know what the result was going to be, he's a monster. Do you see the problem here? So, Exhibit A, God's a monster because God runs tests that he knows the results to, and he knows that the results are going to be wildly negative. And moving right along, I think we dwelled on that long enough. I'll probably come back to it later because there is more I could say on that, but I've said enough for now. So moving right along, you have Cain and Abel. I think it was Cain and Abel. Yeah, we'll go with Cain and Abel. The first idiot who got murdered and the first idiot who did a murdering, apparently. So, there's a lot to cover in this, but we're going to look at, for me, from even being a child, so even while I was steeped in Christianity, this is one of the things that never quite made sense to me. And I know, God making an entire person out of a single rib made sense to me somehow, but this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. So, one of these idiots, I'm going to say it was Cain, he brought God an offering of plants, right? So he's a farmer. He grew up some plants, he brought them before God as a burnt offering, and God rejected that. What was the burnt offering that God was happy with? It was the one of murdered animals. And anyone who knows me, I view animals as just as much of a person as any other person, with pretty much just as much of a right to exist. So I don't believe that humans are something special. So the way I see this is, he shows up with a bunch of murdered people, and God's happy with that one. He praises him for that one. That's a good offering. The guy who shows up with some burnt plants, that, mind you, he spent time and effort growing. No, that's no good. And to me, that's a monster there. Is that pretty much he is only happy when things are dying. You want to get God's attention? You really want to get his attention? You kill somebody. If you really, really want to get his attention, you kill a lot of somebodies. You get later into the Bible where when some of the various biblical characters really wanted to get God's attention, and they literally took thousands of people, and in this case by people, I'm not referring to humans, I'm referring to, four-legged people such as cows and horses, and then you burn them. That's how you get God's attention. That's how you make God. Not only do you get his attention, but you get his attention in a way that he's happy with you. That's a monster. So, moving along at a brisk pace, we get to the payment for our sins. That God finally, after thousands of years of having people murderize animals and burn them, God finally comes up with a solution that apparently, I guess, is going to make him finally happy with a level of dead. And that is, he gets his son, and depending on which group of Christianity you belong to, it's either his son or it's a part of him, but in either case, he inconveniences him for a few years for the whole duration of the project, and then he inconveniences him for about 3 days. See, Jesus, in my opinion, if the story is taken at face value, he didn't rise from the dead. He was inconvenienced for a weekend. Those animals that all got murderized for the last, couple thousand years, they died. So, God's whole plan was, okay, well, see, I'm not going to forgive your species because I liked your burnt offerings of murdered people, but they aren't perfect because they're not me. And that said, I'm the only thing that's perfect. And you're very far from it. But, moving on. So, he decides the only way to do this is he's going to have his son, or him, depending on the way you read it, or your religion, come down here and do a proper sacrifice. So, you have Jesus all come down here, does some magic tricks, and then gets murderized, and then rises from his grave, and we have Christianity. And all you have to do is sell your soul to this monster that required all this in the first place. You remember, this is the all-powerful effing God. There are no rules that apply to this effing God. So he didn't actually have to do this. He could have simply just snapped his fingers and gone, yeah, I decided I'm going to forget everything that happened in the past. Y'all free again. But no. You see, he's not happy unless he has a bunch of subjects kneeling before him, groveling. And people say the whole reason why he went with humanity instead of the angels, that the perfect angels, was that the angels were too perfect and they just simply mindlessly worshipped him. But in the case, and so he wanted people with free minds to worship him. But the thing is, any time in the Bible that anyone does not follow God's word like a machine, God's pissed. You have one part where one of God's favored kings of Israel, it might have been Saul, might have been a different one, probably was a different one because I can't remember names to save my life. But anyway, did this whole invading a neighboring nation, and he was under orders from God to make sure he killed basically everything. I think he was allowed to take women that were younger than a certain age, and they could enslave them. But so he comes back, and he decides that he brings this cow back because he wants to do a proper sacrifice. for God with this cow. Well, God's pissed because he didn't kill the cow right away, like he told him to. So he's pissed that he tried to make this particular death extra special for God. So now God's pissed with him because he didn't follow his directions like a mindless machine. Because that's what God's interested in. He's not interested in you having free thought. He's not interested in you questioning. He's not interested in you being imaginative. He's interested in you groveling before him on your hands and knees and following his every command like an effing machine. And if you are not able to do that, then you're no good. So that's our God the monster. Now, this can be applied to Islam as well as to Judaism. And I'll be covering probably not Judaism because it tends to be easier for me to lump both of them together because they really are that similar to me, basically, as far as I'm concerned. The difference between a Jew and a Christian is that the Christians are waiting for God to come the second time and the Jews are waiting for him to come the first time. They're both wrong. So that sums that up. So those are a few examples of God being himself a monster in within the Bible, within the story of God. Now, for every example of God being a monster, there's many more of other people of their own being monsters, or simply being monsters at the instruction of God. So, examples of this would be God ordering people to kill their own children. And yes, of course, God stepped in at the last possible second to save him, because he just wanted to see if he would do it. But that's a monster who wants to do something like that. And then you have the general concept of Christianity. So here's Christianity for you in a nutshell. Believe and worship with your whole heart in this being, and while doing so, keep constantly apologizing for things that you may or may not have done, because you're always sinning somehow, some way. By the way, I'm putting a gun to your head, and if you don't do it, you're going to be tortured forever. And then they have the gall to tell me I have a choice in the matter. And the way I usually like to liken this to is, I used to work at a gas station by myself, middle of the night. Now, if someone had walked in there with a gun and put it to my head and told me my options were, I can give him all the money in the register, or I can get shot in the head. I don't really have much of a choice here. My choices are die or give him what he wants. So for Christians to come to me and tell me that I have a choice in the matter, you're either delusional or you're lying. And in reality, for the most part, it's both. It's technically you're lying to me, but you're not lying knowingly, because you are so brainwashed into your religion that you can't actually see the lie for what it is. Because the lie that you're trying to sell me is that I have a choice, but in reality I don't have a choice. My choices are be tortured for all of eternity, or do as you say. Now let's move on to a little bit more of the contradiction that we get in Christianity. Now, I'm picking on Christianity a lot because I was raised Christian for 20 years. I was extremely Christian. I was the level of Christian where we went to church for 4 hours. I think it was 4 hours a week. Yeah, we went to the Sunday school pre-service. Then we went to the actual service. Each of these were an hour. Then we went to the evening service, which is pretty much a recap of the morning service, and then we went to the Wednesday booster shot. And in between this, we also were at mandatory. We had to watch Pastor Arnold Murray on TV for at least an hour. He had like an hour-long broadcast every day. Some days it was 2 hours, and this was on top of of all the church. And then we later started going to a different church that was a couple hours away, and the service itself was a couple hours, and then they had more churchy stuff after that, and then they continued on with watch Pastor Arnold Murray when we got back. So that was my upbringing, and I would debate for Christianity at a drop of a hat. I was very, very invested in my faith. It was, at its height, seemed completely unshakable. And even when it did get finally shaken down to the core, it took a few years for it to really get thrown off and for me to actually, for the first time, experience true freedom. And by the way, if you don't know, true freedom is where you are free to live by your own moral code. In other words, you're free to live in a way that your own mind tells you this is right, this is wrong. So with that, let's jump into an example of this. So in the Bible, the Israelites flee Egypt and they get to a city that's in their way. And their only stake the claim to this city is God said so. So the people that live in this city, they're the bad guys. They're evil. What makes them evil? They're not God's chosen people, and they're on God's chosen people's land. Land that those people didn't own and weren't from. So these people proceed to then do their whole marching around the city a bunch of times, and then God makes the walls, fall down. And it's seen as a good thing in the Bible. Very few people who are in Christianity look at this and go, those Jews were fucking monsters. So, because of that, but the thing for me is, that always rubbed me as wrong. Because by my moral code, regardless of what some sky daddy tells you, if someone else was already on that land, was already living there, did not come at you making a beef with you, but instead you show up to them trying to kick them off their land, you are the bad guy, not the other way around. So, for me, this is an example of both God being a monster and God's followers being little mini monsters that actually do the monstering. So God's the monster for telling these people, hey, this land that these other people live on, oh, F those people. It's your land now. And the people are the monster because they didn't look at their God and go, have you lost your mind? That's not our land, that's their land. How about maybe you give us a promised land that isn't already occupied by people? You're all powerful, aren't you? You can make an area for us to be our promised land that doesn't have people already on it. And then, of course, land of milk and honey. Has anyone actually seen pictures of the Middle East? Like, where these people have this set up at? There's a lot nicer places to move to than that rock. But, moving on. And getting back to our to the original point. That the followers of a religion, and this is religion in general. Religion could be argued to cause most of the world's problems. And if nothing else, religion wastes energy and time. The time that people spend sitting in church, being told the same stories over and over and over again, is time that they could have been spending doing any number of actual useful stuff. Like finding the cure to cancer, or, you know, figuring out world peace, or maybe nuclear fusion. There's all kinds of stuff that can be done in that same time period that we're spending in church. And we look at the amount of time collectively spent in church, it gets astronomical real fast. So, on the very low end of the spectrum, religion wastes your time. A couple notches above wasting your time, religion closes your eyes. Because religion forces you to look at the world through the lens of that religion. And this makes it really hard, probably by design, to leave a religion. Because when you want to go and leave the religion, you have to first critically look at your religion from outside in. But you're pushed not to do that. Because, for instance, in Christianity, questioning God is a sin. But in order to, for instance, say leave the religion, after you realize it's a bunch of bullocks, you have to question God. But you're still in the religion, and questioning God is a sin, so you can never get yourself to actually question God. And there were a few times as a child that I did this, that I had, and I felt legitimate fear. It's one of the few times in my life I felt actual fear, was when I realized I didn't quite fully believe in God at one point, and I was questioning it. And I felt real fear that, that I might be right, that I've been wrong about God all along, and then 2, fear that I might go to hell for having these heretical thoughts that God might not be real. So that kind of fear keeps people in, because you're either, if you start to think about it, will stop yourself, which is exactly what I did at the time. I mean, I think I was only in the neighborhood of 11 to 13. You either stop yourself almost before it can start, or you never let it start in the first place. And that's how a religion manages to maintain people in their religion. And that's also why people who are in a religion tend to be very, very invested in defending their religion. There's a whole field dedicated to that. Because they can't tolerate any serious question to their religion that might make them think, because then the act of thinking for them becomes a sin. Think about, and let's bring this back to Adam and Eve. What was the tree they ate from? Well, it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So, the very basis for the original sin. Now let's back this up a little bit. What Satan himself, you see, again, just like the Israelites are shown to be the good guys while they're kicking people off their land and while they're invading other lands, and murderizing people for the sake of not being Israelites. At the same time, you have Satan, who's billed as the bad guy, actually being the good guy. Because what does Satan offer Eve when he offers her the fruit? Well, he offers her knowledge. What was God attempting to keep from them by keeping them from the fruit? He was attempting to keep knowledge from them. So, the entire religion, from the get-go, from the first books of the Bible, revolves around knowledge is bad. Knowledge is a sin. If you attempt to gain knowledge, you are sinning. And when you have a religion that is built entirely around the idea of knowledge is sin, it becomes very difficult for anyone in the religion to ever think outside of that religion and to ever seriously question their religion. In my case, I eventually did, and I'm very grateful I did because it made me much freer than I ever was as a Christian. Because no longer was every action and thought weighed against the moral code of a book that I could never fully understood, and that the parts I did were grinding against the moral code already built into me. And now I could simply weigh everything against the moral code built into me. And among the changes for me, post-Christian, was I became vegetarian because my moral code dictated that eating people was bad. Because, and this is one thing I do take from the Bible. I use the Bible as a way to vocalize the idea, which is pretty much, if you don't want it done to you, don't do it to somebody else. And I sure as hell don't want to get eaten. So I'm not going to eat other people. I don't harm anyone without being attacked. I have actually very, very strict rules regarding when I can use violence, how I can use violence, and when violence must terminate. And these were all things I did not have as a Christian. They were all things that came after, and they came from within. I didn't have to be told that causing harm was bad. I knew that causing harm was bad. I don't need a religion to tell me, for instance, not to murder my neighbor. I don't need a religion to tell me not to rape a woman. I don't need a religion to tell me anything. I, on my own, can figure it out.